Hey everybody, we're going to start taking a look at the Vietnam War in America, and we're going to try and get ourselves set up as to why the Vietnam War happened and how did America get involved. And I think the easiest thing to start with here is that before World War II, Vietnam belonged to the French. And I think that's the easiest way to start this, is that just before World War II, Vietnam belonged to the French. And then, during World War II, Vietnam was conquered by the Japanese. So during World War II, it was conquered by the Japanese. And there was a guy who fought against the Japanese in Vietnam, and an army that fought against the Japanese in Vietnam, and they're called the Viet Minh. And we sent aid to Vietnam, just like we did to China and all these other countries, to help them expel Japanese forces. So we sent aid to these different countries and to the Viet Minh to help them expel Japanese forces. And what happens then is, as World War II comes to a close and Japan is defeated, France tries to reconquer Vietnam. So we have, before World War II, it's owned by the French. During World War II, it's conquered by the Japanese, and we send aid to an army fighting there called the Viet Minh. And then after World War II, the French are going to want to conquer it again. And that means that we have to figure out what we want to do as a nation. And so when France's troops returned to Vietnam in 1946, they drive the Viet Minh, the army that we were helping, into the countryside. And we have to choose a side. Do we want to help the Viet Minh still, or do we want to help France? And so we actually begin to help France, because remember, now that we're in the Cold War, and I'm going to circle this part here that'll help us understand why this happens. President Eisenhower is afraid that if France loses to the Viet Minh, then we'll have a communist Vietnam. And so President Eisenhower kind of clarifies what he calls the domino theory. He says, if France falls to communism, so would other nations in Southeast Asia. So he says you have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what's going to happen is that the last one is going to go over pretty quickly. So what you can see then is this fear that Eisenhower has, which would be that if Vietnam goes communist, and here's Vietnam right here, right? If France loses to the Viet Minh and Vietnam goes communist, then Laos will go communist, and Cambodia will go communist, and Thailand will go communist. And you all know that in the Cold War, which happened after World War II, we're against communism. So President Eisenhower says we're going to have to help out France because we don't want Vietnam to go communist. And the Cold War goes on for about 6 or 7 years after the end of World War II, with France fighting against the Viet Minh, and they lose a key battle at a place called Dien Bien Phu, and that convinces the French to leave Vietnam. They say, we're going to get out of Vietnam, we can't stay. So now Eisenhower's fear that the domino theory could come true is out there. So how do we prevent Vietnam from going communist if the French are going to withdraw from Vietnam? What can we do? And so what happens is there's something called the Geneva Accords. And the Geneva Accords says that everyone in Vietnam should get free elections to unite the North and the South. And what that means is that the northern half of Vietnam in 1954 wanted to be communist, and the southern half wanted to be a democracy. So you have the communists up here who in the north, and the people who wanted to be democratic down here in the south. And so with France leaving, what that means is that they should have an election to be all one thing or all the other. But there was a dictator in South Vietnam, a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem, and he refused. He said that there's absolutely no reason to hold an election because this pro-West government in South Vietnam would surely win. And when this happens, the people of South Vietnam become furious because they want their election, and many of them want it to be communist. So they create a guerrilla army, an army that's going to fight South Vietnam, and they call it the Viet Cong. This is going to be a guerrilla army that fights against the people of South Vietnam. And South Vietnam really, it becomes a war zone where the dictator of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, he responds viciously. He moves people literally out of their houses into concentration camps. They're fortified villages, and he calls them strategic hamlets, but really they're like prison camps. They're like internment camps that we had in America during World War II. And the goal there is to protect these villagers and keep them from aiding the Viet Cong. So what you end up seeing then is when Ngo Dinh Diem says, no, we're not going to hold elections, this split between the North and the South of Vietnam stays. The split remains. And then you get a new guerrilla army called the Viet Cong fighting against South Vietnam. That's what you end up seeing happening here. America gets sucked into this when all of a sudden a torpedo boat fires on us off Vietnam's coast and we declare war because someone from North Vietnam fired on us. And the war itself is terribly destructive. The Viet Cong in South Vietnam use really deadly tactics like booby traps that look like this. So this would be all covered over so that you wouldn't be able to see it. It would be all covered over right on top here with leaves and brush that you wouldn't be able to see. And then when you stepped on it, you would fall through and you would end up getting your foot caught right inside that trap. It would just roll right down and the spikes would just roll through your feet and your legs, giving you puncture holes all throughout your legs and your feet. That's an example of one of the kinds of booby traps that they had. Another example of a booby trap would be this, which is just a grenade that is tied to a branch. And if you bump into this branch in the middle of a jungle where you can barely see, the pin falls out of the grenade and the whole thing explodes. And that grenade, that pineapple grenade that's right there, will end up just blowing everyone up entirely. So how do you fight against an enemy like this that is hiding in jungle where you can't see them and they use terribly deadly silent traps? They use booby traps. How do you fight them? And the answer is, well, you get rid of the jungle. We dropped napalm, which is that jellied gasoline that we had first dropped in World War II that explodes on contact to burn out the Viet Cong and their soldiers. So there's an example of napalm falling on the jungle so that we don't have our soldiers hurt. Here's another example. Napalm is still used, by the way. This is napalm that was dropped on Syrian rebels in Syria. Another example of napalm being dropped right there. So yeah, so we dropped napalm to burn the jungles to get to the Viet Cong. And really our troops face some really big problems because most people in South Vietnam want the Viet Cong to win. And the North Vietnamese army is assisting the Viet Cong. In fact, they were sending arms and supplies south through a network of paths known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So you have all of these supplies coming out of North Vietnam down this trail and going into South Vietnam. And once they get to South Vietnam, the Viet Cong gets them, and then they're able to use those supplies against America. Well, why don't we attack that supply line? Why don't we attack that Ho Chi Minh Trail? Well, President Johnson refuses to allow a full-scale attack on the Ho Chi Minh Trail because it goes through countries that aren't technically in the war. It's like Cambodia. Cambodia is not in the war, and neither is Laos up here that I'm also coloring in. So those countries are not really in the war. So why would you want to bring them into the war by dropping bombs on them? On top of that, on top of the fact that the Viet Cong are getting supplies and weapons from North Vietnam, they're also, those supplies are coming to North Vietnam from China and the Soviet Union. So China and the Soviet Union send the supplies to North Vietnam. North Vietnam puts them on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and sends them to the Viet Cong. That's a problem, because if we go after the Ho Chi Minh Trail, we drag other countries into it. If we go after North Vietnam, then we might bring China into the war, and China has nukes, the Soviets have nukes, but by placing limits on this war in Vietnam, President Johnson makes it really hard to win. Now, I think that's a real simple way to look at the beginning of Vietnam, and we'll talk more about this in class.